Hey everyone, it's Scott from certmedia.com, and in this video we're going to be going over Autoptimize. Autoptimize we covered last year, and we're going to be going through it again because there are some changes to the plugin that we're going to want to discuss. We're just going to review to make sure you're using the most optimal settings for your website, and we're going to talk about the impact that this will kind of have on your core web vitals if that's what you're concerned with. So just go ahead and make sure you have Autoptimize installed. You probably already do. We're going to walk through each of the settings panels, and we're just going to talk about each section. Now, Autoptimize has added the Critical CSS paid add-on, and they also have an unused CSS add-on. Both of these are premium. You have to pay for them separately, which is totally fine. The one thing I want you to keep in mind, though, is if you're not paying for them, we're not really going to talk about them in this video. Also, you're not going to get a lot of benefit with the native critical CSS feature called Inline and Defer, which does not generate critical CSS. I'll show you a free website you can go to generate this CSS, but just keep in mind that the free version of Autoptimize, while very useful for its cost of being free, does come with limitations. So we're going to go ahead and start with the JavaScript settings. JavaScript is probably what's going to kill most of your core web vitals performance. And this is because when the Lighthouse calculates your page's score, it's basing it off of the 6 key measurements that it gives you. The opportunities that it suggests are just that. They are just suggestions that could potentially increase your score. There's not necessarily a guarantee. On the flip side, sometimes those suggestions can actually decrease your performance by doing things such as preloading fonts, which, while that sounds good in concept, it can end up causing you troubles down the line because preloading many font files can have the inverse effect of increasing the largest contentful paint time. JavaScript, though, is what's really going to be hurting 2 key metrics: total blocking time and time to interactive. The reason that it does that is because, quite frankly, JavaScript is expensive, and a lot of WordPress websites overuse it. I had a site that had around 500 kilobytes of JavaScript. Now, for reference, my homepage on certmedia.com on the initial load for all assets weighs about 98 kilobytes, I think it was the last time I measured. 98 kilobytes is significantly smaller than 500 kilobytes of just raw compressed JavaScript. If you have a site where you're loading that much JavaScript, there isn't much that can feasibly help you without damaging the user experience. And by that I mean you'll have to go ahead and delay JavaScript till interaction, and it will cause you other issues. Autoptimize doesn't have any of those options. Pretty much all those options you'd have to find in premium plugins, which is totally fine. You can get decent performance with Autoptimize. What I recommend doing is going to your JavaScript options, and then for the optimized JavaScript code, you'll obviously need to enable this for the settings to activate. If you have a lot of JavaScript, which a lot of you probably do if you're using off-the-shelf themes, aggregating the JavaScript files will still probably end up yielding you better performance, even if you're on HTTP 2 or HTTP 3 environments. The reason for that is because the compressed package size, which is going to be the amount of JavaScript in kilobytes of that merged file, will end up still being smaller than the individual files, even if they're all minified. And that's because you get better compression ratios with Brotli and gzip when you have very large files. And if you're really curious on how that works, the easiest way I could describe it is imagine every occurrence of a word like in a sentence. So let's say you had a sentence, I thought I went to the store today, I guess I didn't. So you use the word I 3 times, just for the sake of demonstration. When you use Brotli and gzip, what that does is it takes each of the like terms, or common phrases or code, and it basically eliminates the duplicates, and it puts in the compression algorithm, it basically puts like an index of where it was and how it used, so that way the total package size ends up being smaller. When you have a lot of code that's very redundant, which is very common on WordPress websites due to themes overriding libraries that they include and plugins overriding themes and yada yada yada, you get to the point of there's a lot of redundant code. So when you aggregate the files, you'll get a smaller package size. Also, Autoptimize will move that package into the footer of the website, and it will defer it. If for some reason you're not getting better performance with the aggregate.js, if you disable this option and choose do not aggregate but defer, what it will do is it'll minify the JavaScript files and it will add the defer attribute to them without aggregating them. You will still get performance gains even if you don't aggregate the files. I'm going to go ahead and aggregate them though because I'm assuming that most of you have a lot of JavaScript, quite frankly, a lot of it being redundant. You could choose to aggregate inline JavaScript, and while in theory this is good because it removes uncacheable JavaScript from the document and puts it in a file that can be cached, the problem is it can make the auto-optimize cache grow out of control. If you enable this option because some plugin or theme feature stops working, this is not a good solution because what that typically means is there's a bit of inline JavaScript that's dynamic. When there's a dynamic bit of JavaScript, every time somebody visits the page, a new JavaScript file will be generated. This can cause your cache size to generate up to several gigs of files I've seen. And this little toolbar functionality will actually start flashing with a red light saying, your cache size is getting out of control, you should take a look. I never recommend checking this option. You're better trying to figure out what JavaScript to exclude than try and check this option to try and fix an issue that may come up. Forcing the JavaScript in the head is never a good idea. Even if you're using something like Cloudflare to use the rocket loader, it's not going to fix many issues. The only times really that you're really going to use this option is if for some reason you want to aggregate all the JavaScript into one file, which isn't that important. jQuery.js is typically the only JavaScript file you need to ignore in WordPress unless you have some weird coded files and the minify engine breaks it. This is typically the only file you're going to need to exclude. Some themes from ThemeForest that have some wonky JS I've seen, or they encode some weird JavaScript with like base64 for some odd reason, that's when you may need to exclude a file, but most of the time you don't need to worry about excluding any JavaScript with Autoptimize because it already excludes jQuery.min.js for you. If you have a site that you know that you can combine jQuery, just go ahead and remove the lines here. For those of you who are not a developer, just leave it as it is. And never check this option. It would be better off trying to uncheck the aggregate.js files and using the do not aggregate but defer rule. Because if you're having JavaScript errors, forcing all the JavaScript in the head is just going to cause the rest of the website to load slowly. Because as it mentions, the JavaScript will not only be render blocking now, you've now got a very large amount of JavaScript that's render blocking. And that's something you want to avoid at all costs. Add try-catch wrapping. If for some reason you have a JavaScript error and you're not sure what it is, you could try checking this option, but don't check it for the sake of checking it. Try-catch wrapping can actually affect your JavaScript performance and it can slow it down quite a bit. So only enable it if it for some reason fixes an issue, which is incredibly rare. You're better off trying to figure out what file broke and excluding it than to try and use try-catch wrapping. It's just not a very good solution. For the CSS options, not much has changed here from my last video on the recommendations. I do recommend aggregating the files for the same reason as the JavaScript. You'll get smaller compression, you'll get smaller files due to better compression ratios. More so with CSS, in fact, because every time you iterate on a CSS rule to override it, that's when you're going to get a lot of redundancy. You see this all the time with themes, especially if you're using WooCommerce. So WooCommerce by default will load its own WooCommerce CSS. Your theme, if they're not using the WooCommerce styling template, will load their own CSS file on top of that to override aspects of the default WooCommerce CSS. This will save you quite a bit of bytes. I use this on basically every website, and you tend to end up getting performance gains for the sole fact of smaller compression ratios, smaller files due to better compression ratios. And while there's a small overhead with the request in HTTP2, that's not really why you do this. You really do it to get the smaller files. You can try aggregating inline CSS, but to go back to that inline JavaScript warning, if you notice your cache size getting very large, which can happen with aggregating inline CSS, though less likely, uncheck this option. The reason it's less likely is it's very rare for you to have inline CSS that is dynamic. Now, if you're using something like WP Bakery, that will generate inline CSS dynamically for the page. And the reason it does that is it does it for background images in particular. So if you use WP Bakery, do not check this option. If you have a pretty well-coded theme and you just have a little bit of inline CSS, maybe from the customizer additional CSS section, go ahead and enable it and just monitor your cache size for like the next day. So say you put this on in the evening, check back in the morning, see if your cache size is getting very large very quickly. If it is, uncheck this option, though it will be less common. Now we're going to talk about generating data URIs for images. Previously, we did suggest using this option. Now the question really comes down to, should you still use this? And the answer is, it depends. Generating data URIs for images, what it does is it takes an image file and it base64 encodes it. The reason that that's beneficial is very small image files, you might be able to get performance gains by just having the browser figure out what the image is supposed to be with the code that's provided in the file. The problem is that it's very rare, and data URI images do increase the cache size. The benefit, they do increase the file size. It's only a little bit of bytes over it, but still. The other negative though is it only does it for smaller files. So if you have background images in your CSS, they will not be encoded, which is probably a good thing in the end. If you have background image files in your CSS, you'll want them to be cached. That way the user on additional pages, or if they return, can easily just spin them back up. It'll be in the file. It'll be in their cache to retrieve. This option you may have to be careful with, and you'll have to do testing. My general recommendation is to avoid using background images in CSS files if you can, for the sole purpose of when you load the file in a background image in your CSS as opposed to in the document, it now has to read that CSS, which if you're using the next option, it can cause issues with it appearing quickly and you'll have to use a preload. But let's just ignore that for now. Test this option on your own website. If you have effectively very little background images, maybe you're using it for a search icon, this will probably get you performance gains. If you have many background images, all of varying small size because you're using them for your Facebook icon, Twitter icon, and you have 20 plus background images, this will cause you issues because now you're just generating more CSS instead of downloading image files, which would still be faster. You'll have to play with it, but the general rule is if you have a couple of small background image files, this will probably do better for you. If you have many small background image files, this will cause problems because now you've just generated a ton of CSS for the browser to parse. But that takes us into the next section, inline and defer CSS. This is a hit or miss option. If you're not using the critical CSS feature, this is not going to be a good option. The reason it's not going to be a good option is because it's going to be quite difficult to generate critical CSS for your website. Almost every premium caching tool has a paid, in their paid feature set, a critical CSS generator. WordPress Rocket has it, Smush Pro has it. I think Hummingbird has it, or maybe they're working on it. I can't recall off the top of my head because I don't use it. But this plugin does not unless you pay for the critical CSS, which is to be expected. The problem is, while you can generate your critical CSS, if you're using an Elementor website or an Avado website, or really anything where your pages are not consistent in layout and structure, this is going to cause a very noticeable CLS, and it's going to cause flash of unstyled content on pages where the style differs greatly. And there's not really a good fix unless you pay for the Pro add-on. There is a filter, which is PHP code, that allows you to configure it and paste in critical CSS. That's not a very good fix though, if you're watching a video on how to get the best settings, because that's going to require a lot of custom code. It's going to require a lot of documentation for you to walk through and generate it for each of them. But if you want to try this, I'll show you how to do it. So this is critical CSS that I've just generated using an online tool. All you have to do really is type into Google, critical CSS generator. And there's a couple of them. Pegasus is one, and you basically will just copy your site URL and will generate the CP CSS, which is the critical CSS. They will try to get you to sign up for their paid plugin. I wouldn't really say that that's required, and it looks like it had an issue generating it. That's fine. we're not going to give up that easy. If we look for our CSS file, we can copy the CSS from the critical CSS path generator. So we'll just come over here. That's not the correct CSS file, is it? That's probably more like it. There it is. So we'll copy from the CSS file on the critical path CSS generator. This will be the first website that appears in Google for you. If the Pegasus one doesn't work, this is the one I recommend just because it's more likely to work, but Pegasus is a lot easier. So you'll take the merged style sheets CSS, then you'll take the URL of your site, and then you'll stick that into here and see what it generates. And it generated some CSS, we'll paste it in there, and that's how you get the critical CSS totally free. Now, as I mentioned, uncomplicated websites, this is going to cause obvious CLS issues because the layout is going to be different page to page when you have different background images, different fonts and headings being used. So this is not a really good option. If you have small websites that are very simple, like this 2020 theme that's active on this website, it won't cause you that much headache, but I want you to be aware of the limitations of this free tool. Finally, there is the inline all CSS. I'm just going to check this off for you guys to understand that you typically shouldn't use this unless you have very simple websites. But the inline all CSS is the next. Never use this, but I always seeing it used for some weird reason. What this will do is it'll take all your CSS, it'll aggregate it, and then inline it into the document as an inline style. This is an absolutely terrible idea for the sole purpose of this has no tree shaking. This will aggregate all CSS, no matter how large it is, and stick it in the document. This is not beneficial because you're going to have a lot of CSS and you're going to have a very significant slowdown in your rendering, and it's going to make that CSS no longer cacheable. The only time you should ever inline all CSS is if you have a very small amount of CSS, or you're doing a tree shaking process, kind of like an AMP. What AMP does is there's no style sheet that's included. Instead, it takes the CSS for the page, it figures out by using a tree shaking tool that was built for the AMP plugin to generate the layout of the page. For most of your themes, this is just going to cause way too much headache. And the only reason I see people use this is because of some speed optimization person that they've hired has turned it on, and it made the remove unused CSS warning go away. And that was because for a long time, with very large amounts of inline CSS, it would not properly generate a suggestion to warn you of the unused CSS in your document, in Lighthouse and in PageSpeed Insights. It should warn you now, but you should just never use this option, really ever, unless you have very small themes or site in general. Just never check this option. Finally, optimize HTML code. There's a little bit of a debate whether this is really worth doing. It depends. If you're using a page caching plugin, the overhead from this is probably very minimal, but optimizing HTML code is something that was taken out of WordPress Rocket for the sole purpose of it's going to cost your server more resources to generate a minified HTML page than you're going to be saving in bytes. It's normally less than a 1% gain because the page is already gzipped or served with Brotli. So there's not really any benefit to you doing this, but some people like having a minified HTML output. And so long as you're using a page caching plugin like Cache Enabler, this will remove the major overhead from this process from repeat visitors. If you have a CDN, you just put your CDN CNAME here and it will serve all your assets from it for the auto-optimized files. It's totally a fine option and it works. There are some new miscellaneous options that we can talk about real quick. So saving the aggregated script in CSS as static files should always be checked. Never serve it as PHP. Unless you have a really weird issue, but even then you should resolve that with your host instead of serving it as PHP. There's just never a good reason to do that. Minify excluded in CSS files. So if you exclude a CSS or JavaScript file from being combined because you have the aggregate features enabled, it will still minify them, which is something you should do. Now, if for some reason the minify engine is breaking it with this option enabled, just go ahead and disable it, and the excluded files will no longer be minified, but that main merged package will still be minified. Enabling 404 fallbacks is a great awesome feature. I'm very glad that they added this. What this does is it does as the name implies. If a CSS or JavaScript file 404s, which does happen and sometimes people get flagged for it in Search Console as a warning, like, hey, you have an increase in 404s, this will just generate a fallback file for the server to send you to. That way, you don't get those warnings anymore. It's not really going to do anything on the front end, and it's not really going to do much, but it will stop those pesky warnings. The only time that this may save you, so to speak, is if you have a weird caching setup on your edge. So let's say you're using something like Sakuri, which has page caching enabled on its default recommended cache level. That can sometimes lead to files 404ing, but this can help resolve those, and that shouldn't really happen if you have a proper cache setup, because Autoptimize's cache doesn't clear automatically anyway. And then you can finally do it for enabling the optimizations for logged in editors and administrators. I recommend doing this to test. I do not really recommend enabling it after the fact, because if you have a page builder, this can lead to breakages with the page builder. But if you're trying to test your options to make sure nothing's broken and you just for some reason are not wanting to spin up a incognito window to test, this is an easy way to easily test and check your results. Go ahead and enable it, but disable if you have any page builder that you're using on the front end of the website after you're fully set up. So let's go ahead and save and empty the cache. And just to review, these are the options that we have enabled. Now we're going to go to the next section. Images. The images section is a paid section more or less. The most important feature is Short Pixel's global CDN. If you enable this, it will enable the Short Pixel Adaptive Images CDN to serve your images as WebP, and it will compress them on their edge. If you're not paying for that feature though, this will not do anything for you. All it does is it saves you from having to install Short Pixel Adaptive Images. Moving on, if you're not paying for it, this gives you no benefit. Lazy loading images. This will enable the lazy load images feature, which will just stop the browser from downloading images immediately unless they're in viewport. However, there's actually a really smart and clever new feature here. For one, you can now exclude file names or classes, and you just go ahead and include, if you have a file on your front end that you want to exclude, let's just call it example.jpg. That will exclude it from being lazy loaded. But more importantly than doing that is lazy load from nth image. Now, what this will do is it will tell Autoptimize you should not be lazy loading an image unless it's after, say, the 4th image on the page. So if you put this here, the first 4 images on the page at all will not be lazy loaded, and the 5th image down will be lazy loaded. And you might be wondering why you should do this. There's a couple of obvious reasons. Number one, if you have a logo in your header that's an image, or maybe some other icons in there that are also image files, this will reduce CLS. It will also improve your largest contentful paint time, because the featured image or your hero image will not be lazy loaded. And it will also improve your first contentful paint time if you have any other images that are major in the top of your page. And it may affect the speed index a little bit, but more or less, this is just overall a very smart feature. The reason that this improves the performance, while it sounds counterintuitive, is for the simple fact of when you're lazy loading an image, you're telling the browser that it cannot download this image. The only reason that images in the viewport get downloaded right away is because the JavaScript library that's handling the lazy load process gets downloaded eventually, and the browser's like, oh, this one's in the viewport, plus or minus the threshold, and it immediately downloads it. The problem with this process is the browser's unable to download the image until the JavaScript gets fetched. And while for an average user on a very good PC or smartphone device, for users who have slow internet or are on cheaper devices, this is going to cause a major bottleneck. For the simple reason of JavaScript is expensive, the more of it you have on the page, and if you're deferring that JavaScript on top of it, the user's now going to have to wait until everything down the page is read, all that JavaScript or CSS files before it are fetched and downloaded, and that JavaScript is downloaded, executed, and ran for those images to render. It doesn't sound like a lot, but you could save on this mobile performance test quite a bit of time by not making your above the fold content dependent on JavaScript. So this is a good feature to use. If you're unsure of what to do, more or less, just stick the number 2 if you're unsure. That typically means that you have a logo and the hero banner / featured image. That will exclude them. If you know for a fact that you have custom icons or images in your header, whether it's for a menu button or some social media buttons, you'll have to count those up manually, and then you'll have to go ahead and exclude them. Remember, you don't need to do this for font icons. You just have to do it for image files that use the image tag. If you're unsure, just go ahead and put 2. For the Critical CSS section, remember this is the paid add-on that you'll need to pay for at criticalcss.com to make use of. Honestly, there's not really much to say about it. We will not be going over it because it's a paid feature and it's an add-on to this plugin. If you all really want me to at some point to cover it, I will, but for the sake of this video, we're going to skip it. And then finally, the extra section. For extra auto optimizations, the settings haven't really changed too much here. Number 1, for the Google fonts, combine the fonts and link them in the header with font display swap and load it asynchronously. This will avoid using the slow web font JS, which is why it's deprecated. It will give you the benefits of no longer being render blocking, unlike this option. You should never really remove your Google fonts unless you want to get a larger performance boost, but you want your page to no longer look the same way it did. And you should never leave it as it is because you probably don't have them optimized in the first place. Remove emojis. You should always remove the emoji.js and inline CSS because you're never going to use them. The browser can render emojis natively, and there's not really an inherent benefit of keeping that JavaScript except for consistency in the styling, so I just don't recommend doing it. And then you can remove query strings from static resources. This is totally a preference. It does not really help improve performance, as it mentions, but some people don't like including the query strings at the end of CSS and JavaScript files, and that's really the only reason to do this. Previously, Pingdom and GTMatrix used it in part of their scoring algorithms, and now neither one of them uses it. Pre-connect to third-party domains. I get asked about pre-connects and preloads all the time. The easiest way I can explain this is don't pre-connect to anything that you're unsure of. Don't go to someone's website, because I see terrible articles all over the internet by very poor marketing gurus who try to give you a list of pre-connect headers to add to your website. And I see websites all the time, and they come to me, and I look, and they're like, I installed, let's just say WordPress Rocket, and I installed and I added these prefetch lists, and now my website's still doing bad. Or they're using the pre-connect header in Perf Matters, and they included a bunch of URLs. And normally the first thing I end up doing is I just end up removing them, because there's not really a benefit unless those pre-connect headers are for something that's essential. Otherwise, all you're doing is telling the browser you need to open up like 10 URLs to start fetching the SSL and to opening up the pipe for the files to be sent through. And if those files are never sent, you've just wasted, let's just say, 200 milliseconds. Now, it's not 200 milliseconds per request, but it does add overhead to the browser for downloading additional requests down the line. So just don't add them here if you're unsure. And you shouldn't preload anything unless you're sure that you're actually going to need it. And don't add anything here like images that PageSpeed Insights tells you to preload. And you probably shouldn't do fonts either, for the sole reason of this will add it globally, and pages can have different images and different fonts, and adding it here will make it global. It'll be a global preload for all pages, and if that resource isn't used on one page, that's going to cause you a headache. Don't preload anything in here unless you're certain that it's needed and it gets flagged in the performance test and it's global. Don't pre-connect to anything unless for some reason the tool can suggest to you what to pre-connect to, but don't grab some random list off the internet. And you don't need to pre-connect to Google Fonts. That's already handled for you automatically. The Optimize More tab real quick is just all the affiliate programs to buy other plugins and whatnot. Great section. This will give you the rapid load, which is the remove unused CSS tool. We could probably talk about that in a later video. But That's really all there is in the new version of Autoptimize. They've gone through, they've just refined the plugin. The best new thing that they added was that excluding lazy load images from the nth image. That will improve your largest contentful paint time and your first contentful paint time. If you have any questions about the new version of Autoptimize, feel free to ask in the comments below, and I'll try to help you out. Otherwise, make sure to like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.